The screams rose first, sharp and ragged, echoing through the marble corridors like the wails of some ancient beast caught between life and death. Torches guttered against the black stone walls, their light struggling to pierce the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. Somewhere beyond the great iron doors, metal hissed in molten waves. It was not war, not even execution in the ordinary sense. It was spectacle. The courtyard of the citadel had been transformed into an arena of terror. Soldiers in burnished bronze stood shoulder to shoulder, their spears glinting like shards of frozen lightning. Their faces were blank masks, hiding whatever thoughts clawed behind their eyes. Before them, the great cauldron roared its belly, swollen with a molten tide of gold, heated until it shimmered like the surface of the sun. The air shimmered above it, and the smell, that smell clung to every breath, sweet and rancid, as if the earth itself had turned against mankind. At the edge of the cauldron knelt the condemned. Chains clinked against the stone as they were dragged forward, men of noble birth, their silk robes already scorched from the heat, their skins slick with sweat. Some wept silently. Others spat curses toward the gilded throne where he sat, the mad king, his crown tilted lazily on his brow, as though even gold could not bear the weight of his skull. His eyes were the color of old copper, dull, but dangerous when they caught the light. They were fixed on the prisoners, not in judgment, but in the hungry way a predator watches its prey. No one spoke his birth name anymore. In whispered corners of the city, they called him the Gilded Butcher, the son of blood, the king who ate his own shadow. To his face, they called him nothing at all. A court scribe dipped his quill into black ink, ready to record the names of the condemned. But the king waved a languid hand. "No names," he said, his voice smooth as poisoned wine. "Only the gold." The first man was forced to his feet. His chains rattled as two guards pushed him forward. For a moment, the molten gold reflected in his eyes, turning them into molten suns. He opened his mouth to beg, perhaps to pray, but his voice was lost in the sudden roar as the king raised his arm. The signal. The guards seized him by the shoulders and, with one practiced motion, shoved him into the waiting mouth of the cauldron. The sound was not what one might expect. There was no splash, no scream drawn out into the air, only a terrible, wet hiss, followed by the sudden, violent thrashing of a body being unmade in the heat. The smell deepened, filling every corner of the court, searing itself into the memory of every witness. The king leaned forward, his chin resting lightly on his fist. There was no satisfaction in his face, only calculation, as if each death was a number in some private ledger. One by one, the prisoners followed. Some struggled until their flesh blistered against the soldiers' hands. Others walked silently, their eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. The cauldron devoured them all, turning men into gold-plated ghosts. When the last had been swallowed by the molten tide, the king gave a small nod. The court's alchemists hurried forward with long-handled ladles, dipping into the golden pool to draw out the remains, half-formed skulls, encased in precious metal. Hands frozen mid-reach. These, the king declared, would be trophies for the palace hall. Above the courtyard, the night sky spread wide and starless, the heavens themselves turning away from what they had seen. Somewhere in the city, mothers gathered their children close, whispering the old prayers faster than their lips could form the words. But prayers had no place here. The king rose, his robe sweeping the ground like a shadow made flesh. He stepped down from the throne and walked toward the cauldron, its molten surface reflecting his figure in fractured shards. He did not look away from it, not even as the heat licked his skin. "Gold," he murmured, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "is the only truth in this world, and truth must be paid in blood." The soldiers bowed. The alchemists froze mid-motion. Somewhere deep within the palace, a clock told the hour, and so began the reign of the Mad King, an era where fear became currency, cruelty became law, and the line between man and monster vanished in the shimmer of molten gold. What no one in that courtyard knew, not the guards, not the scribes, not even the king himself, was that this night would be remembered for centuries, not because of the deaths it claimed, but because it marked the first crack in the golden mask he wore. Beneath it, something darker was already stirring. History would call him mad, but madness was not born in him, it was made, piece by piece, by the same gold that now glistened in the moonless dark. The city of Ayartha was born from rivers of gold. It was not built upon fertile plains, nor nestled in the safety of mountains, but sprawled across an unforgiving expanse of desert stone. The land gave nothing freely, not a drop of water, not a single harvest, yet beneath its cracked surface ran veins of metal so pure it seemed stolen from the bones of the sun. The people called it Orium, the eternal gold dot. From the moment it was discovered, blood followed. Wars burned across the desert as neighboring kingdoms sent armies to claim it. Men starved for bread, but slaughtered for the sake of gleaming coins. Fortresses rose on the backs of slaves. Gold was no longer currency. It became destiny. By the time the Mad King was born, Ayartha was a city of contradictions. Its palace walls glittered with hammered sheets of gold leaf, while in the alleys outside, the poor slept on bare stone. The great market overflowed with merchants selling silks and spices, but beggars huddled in their shadows, their hands outstretched like wilted branches. His birth name was Kael. He was the third son of King Derith, a ruler who believed more in spectacle than governance. Derith's court was a place of feasts that lasted days, of peacocks in gilded cages, of fountains that poured wine instead of water, while beyond the palace gates the commonwealths ran dry. Kael's mother, Queen Selira, was a woman of quiet grace, known for her beauty and her distant, unreadable eyes. She bore her children without ceremony, raised them with tutors and guards rather than her own hands, and rarely spoke in public. The court whispered that she came from a conquered people, married to Derith as part of a treaty. Some claimed her lineage carried ancient curses. Kael grew up in marble halls, but not in love. His elder brothers were trained for war and diplomacy, while he was left to drift in the margins of the court. He learned to watch, to listen, to note how smiles could be weapons sharper than blades. He learned early that gold could buy anything except loyalty. Outside the palace, Ayartha's grip on the surrounding territories was tightening. The gold mines, vast pits where thousands labored under the sun, were guarded by soldiers who answered only to the king. The work was brutal. Men died from heatstroke, from cave-ins, from the slow rot of lungs filled with dust. The dead were dragged away without ceremony, replaced within hours. But the gold kept flowing, and with it came envy. Neighboring kingdoms, Heriveth to the west, Senthal to the north, watched Ayartha grow fat on its wealth. Armies began to muster on the borders. Derith's advisors urged him to prepare for war, but the king waved them off. In his mind, Ayartha's gold was protection enough. It was in this gilded but fragile world that Kael came of age. He was 17. When the first siege came, Heriveth's armies marched under banners of black and crimson, their war machines rolling across the desert like metal beasts. The battle lasted 13 days. Ayartha's soldiers fought with desperation, knowing that capture meant slavery or worse. When the dust cleared, Heriveth lay broken at the gates, but Ayartha had paid dearly. Thousands were dead, the mines lay silent, and the streets stank of unburied corpses. It was during this chaos that Kael saw his first execution. A group of captured Heriveth soldiers were paraded into the courtyard. They were gaunt, dust-caked, barely able to stand. Derith ordered them to be burned alive as a warning to the rest. Kael stood among the courtiers, the heat of the pyres washing over his face, and watched without blinking. Some claimed they saw his lips move, as though whispering to the flames. The war ended, but the seeds of something darker had been sown. Kael's elder brothers died within a year, one from a fever that swept through the city, the other from a hunting accident that many whispered was no accident at all. Kael became heir by default, and something in his eyes changed. Where once there had been curiosity, there was calculation. He began spending more time with the alchemists of the palace, studying the properties of metals and fire. He asked questions about melting points, about the durability of gold under heat, about how the shape of a crucible could change the flow of molten metal. The court laughed at his eccentricities. They called him the Golden Prince in jest, imagining him more interested in trinkets than in ruling. They were wrong, because in Kael's mind, gold was not merely wealth, it was purity. It was the one element that did not tarnish, did not decay. To him, it was the truest reflection of power, a mirror that never lied. And he began to wonder what it would mean to unite gold with the flesh of his enemies. The moment that idea took root, there was no turning back. The first true horror of Kael's reign began not with a battle, but with a whisper. It was the 5th year of his rule. Iritho's streets were restless. The mines, though still yielding gold, were claiming more lives than ever. Food was scarce after 2 failed harvests, and among the poor, a rumor had begun to take shape. rumor that the gold of Ayartha was cursed. It started in the miners' quarters, passed between cracked lips over bowls of thin gruel. They said the earth was angry, that for every coin forged, a soul was taken, trapped forever in the metal, that the gold glowed faintly at night because it held the heat of human blood. Kael heard the rumor within days, but instead of silencing it, he fed it. He had the palace alchemists begin experiments melting gold late into the night, pouring it into molds shaped like human skulls, displaying them in the throne room for foreign envoys to see. The effect was immediate. Fear spread like fire through dry grass. Then came the rebellion. It was small at first, merchants refusing to pay the king's taxes, priests speaking cautiously of divine punishment, but Kael saw in it a challenge to his authority, and challenges were not tolerated. He summoned the leaders of the resistance to the palace under the promise of negotiation. 17 men and women came, none left. The palace gates were shut and barred. Kael's guards escorted the rebels to the great courtyard, the same place where the molten cauldron would later become infamous. But that night, the execution was different. The cauldron was already waiting, its surface swirling in liquid gold, the heat warping the air into shimmering ghosts. The rebels were bound at the wrists and ankles. They were not told their fate until Kael himself stepped forward, his robes catching the firelight like molten threads. "You seek to steal the gold of Ayartha," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You seek to make it common, to scatter it like dust. But gold is not for the unworthy. It is for the strong. It is for the eternal. And tonight, it will claim you." The first man was lifted by 4 guards, his bare feet kicking against the stone. He begged, cried, promised to abandon his cause, but Kael did not hear him. The man's body arched in agony as it touched the molten surface. His scream cut short as the gold filled his lungs. The crowd, nobles, soldiers, servants, watched in frozen silence. One by one, the rebels followed. The gold hissed and spat, clinging to skin, devouring flesh, turning bone to gleaming relic. The alchemists waited for Kael's nod before retrieving the remains, arranging them like statues along the palace walls. By morning, the city knew, but fear did not stop the unrest, it transformed it. Now, rebellion hid in shadows. Messages were passed in coded phrases, meetings held in candlelit cellars. The people learned to speak of gold only in whispers, as if the metal itself could hear. Kael responded with what he called the gilded purge. Anyone suspected of sedition was taken, merchants, priests, even children accused of spreading forbidden tales. The executions grew more elaborate. Sometimes the condemned were lowered slowly into the molten gold, their screams stretching into eternity. Other times, Kael ordered the cauldron poured into molds shaped like thrones or shields, with the bodies still inside. These were displayed at the gates of the city as warnings. Foreign envoys began to vanish. Hereveth's ambassador was last, seen entering the palace with a gift of silver. Weeks later, a silver mask fused with a human skull appeared in Kael's trophy hall. Yet through it all, Kael remained calm, deliberate. This was not rage, it was philosophy. To him, gold was the perfect judge. It consumed the weak and preserved them in beauty. It was incorruptible, untouchable by time. By fusing his enemies with it, Kael believed he was granting them a form of immortality they did not deserve, but could never escape. The horror reached its peak during the Feast of the Sun, a festival meant to honor the founding of Ayartha. That year, Kael ordered a grand display in the palace courtyard. Before thousands of citizens, he had an enormous mold constructed in the shape of the city's emblem, a golden phoenix. Into the mold, he poured molten gold, but before it hardened, he had 6 condemned men and women accused of plotting to assassinate him thrown inside. Their bodies were swallowed whole. The mold was broken open before the crowd, revealing the phoenix's wings streaked with human forms, their faces twisted in a final, silent scream. The people gasped. Some fainted. Kael only smiled. And as the festival drums echoed into the night, the gold cooled, locking the dead forever in their gleaming prison. It was no longer just a reign of fear, it was a reign of spectacle, where death was art, and cruelty was the language of kingship. By the 12th year of Kael'varian's reign, Ayartha gleamed brighter than ever. The palace walls were entirely clad in gold leaf. The streets leading to the citadel were lined with statues, some carved from stone, others cast from molten gold. Around the bodies of the condemned, to a foreigner's eye, it was a city of unmatched wealth and splendor. But to those who lived there, Ayartha was suffocating. The air smelled perpetually of metal, a taint that clung to the skin and tongue. The heat from the smelters never ceased. Even in the dead of night, the glow of furnaces painted the horizon in sickly amber. People learned to walk with their eyes down, to keep their voices low, to avoid the notice of soldiers whose armor shone. Like the sun, trade began to wither. Merchants from Heriveth and Senthal no longer came, wary of Kael's unpredictable wrath. Without the steady flow of grain, the poorer districts fell into hunger. Bread riots flared, met each time with swift and brutal reprisals. The king's cauldrons never cooled, yet there was a change in Kael, subtle at first. He appeared less often in public, and when he did, his eyes seemed restless, searching the faces of his court as though reading a language only he understood. He dismissed long-trusted advisers without explanation. Guards were rotated so frequently that few lasted more than a month in the palace before being sent away, or vanishing altogether. The alchemists, once his prized companions, began to fear his summons. He pushed them to experiment with new methods, demanding the gold retain the shape of those it consumed in perfect detail. Every crease in the skin, every strand of hair. When they failed, he had them executed and replaced. It was during this time that the most infamous of his works was created. The Hall of Echoes, once a great audience chamber. It was transformed into a gallery of his enemies. Columns of gold lined the hall, but on closer inspection, each was a human form, arms outstretched, mouths frozen mid-scream, eyes sealed in smooth metal. The acoustics of the room made every footstep sound like a chorus of whispers. Kael began to hold court there, seated on a throne of fused gold and bone, as if the voices of the dead could advise him better than the living. The people of Ayartha called it the Hall of Echoes because, they said, if you stood there long enough, you could hear the muffled cries of those trapped inside. Whether it was truth or superstition no longer mattered. The fear was real. Few entered willingly, but gold, for all its luster, could not keep the outside world at bay. Heriveth and Senthal, once enemies to each other, forged an uneasy alliance. Their scouts reported that Ayartha's mines were running dry, the veins now little more than dust and stone. Armies gathered again on the borders. Kael's generals urged him to prepare for war. He did not listen. Instead, he turned inward, convinced the true threat was not beyond the desert, but within his own walls. He ordered mass arrests, claiming conspiracies everywhere. Nobles who had served him faithfully for years found themselves chained in the courtyard, staring into the molten heart of the cauldron. Servants were questioned under torture about whispered conversations. Even the royal family was not spared. His sister, Princess Myrene, was beloved among the people for her charity. She spoke often of reform, urging Kael to ease the taxes, to open trade again, to dismantle the cauldrons, and end the gilded executions. Kael listened in silence the first time. The second time, he had her confined to her chambers. The third time, she disappeared entirely. The court was told she had been sent to a distant convent, but weeks later, a new golden statue appeared in the Hall of Echoes, a woman with her hands clasped in prayer, her features eerily familiar. It was then the first cracks appeared in the palace's loyalty. Guards deserted. Alchemists fled the city under night's cover. Whole families vanished from the lower quarters, slipping into the desert despite the dangers. The king's reach was still long, but not infinite, and beyond Ayartha, whispers of rebellion began to spread again. Kael, ever watchful, sensed it. He doubled the executions, filling the hall with fresh statues, until there was no space left. The smell of molten metal and charred flesh clung to the palace like incense to a temple. Yet for all his power, there were nights when Kael wandered the empty corridors alone. Servants who caught glimpses of him swore. He muttered to the statues, sometimes cursing them, sometimes speaking as though they answered. In those moments, the man who once calculated every cruelty with precision seemed almost lost, but he was not ready to surrender. He began planning something greater than any execution, something that would, in his words, burn my name into the bones of history. It would require more gold than the mines could produce in a year, more fuel than the furnaces had ever consumed, and it would not be a warning to the people of Ayartha, it would be a warning to the world. Whatever it was, the preparations would be the last act of his reign, because while Kael's eyes were fixed on his masterpiece of terror, the armies of Heriveth and Senthal were already marching across the desert, and the desert remembers. The desert wind that year was different. It carried not just dust, but the sound of distant drums. For weeks, Kael's scouts had reported the approach of the Haravith-Senthal alliance. Tens of thousands of soldiers marched in tight formation, their armor flashing in the sun like shards of a great mirror. Siege engines rolled over the sand, their wheels groaning like old bones. They were coming for Ayartha, not to plunder, but to erase it. Kael did not flinch. If anything, the threat seemed to ignite something deeper in him. The world thinks it can end me, he told his generals, his voice calm, almost amused. It will learn that I am not a man. I am gold, and gold does not break. He unveiled his plan in the Hall of Echoes. The chamber was crowded with soldiers, alchemists, and nobles, those few who still dared remain. At the center of the hall stood a massive structure, half-built, covered in dark canvas. When Kael pulled the cloth away, the room fell into stunned silence. That it was a mold larger than anything they had ever seen. Shaped like a towering obelisk, it rose nearly 3 times the height of a man. At its base were strange openings, and inside, iron cages. The air smelled faintly of resin and oil. "This," Kael said, his hand resting on the mold's flank, "will be my final gift to Ayartha. When the invaders arrive, they will not find a city to conquer. They will find a monument to my reign, an unbreakable pillar, filled with the traitors who thought they could defy me." The plan was madness, even for him. The obelisk would be cast entirely from molten gold, poured around living prisoners. Hundreds would die inside it, their bodies hidden forever within the shining metal. It would stand at the gates of the city, as a warning to any who thought to take Ayartha's riches. Preparations began at once. Kael ordered every scrap of gold in the city seized, coins, jewelry, even the decorative leaf stripped from the palace walls. The furnaces roared day and night, their fires visible for miles. Prisoners were dragged from the dungeons in chains, their screams echoing through the narrow streets as they were forced into the iron cages. The people of Ayartha watched in silence. Some whispered prayers, others simply turned away, knowing that to be seen watching too long was dangerous. But beyond the desert, the enemy was closing in. The allied armies moved with grim precision, their commanders knowing that time was on their side. Kael's obsession with his monument was slowing the city's defenses. Walls were left unmanned, supplies were dwindling, and still, the king poured every resource into the obelisk. On the 5th day of the siege, the drums came closer. By then, the obelisk was nearly complete. The furnaces spat gouts of flame, the molten gold flowing in thick streams into the waiting mold. Inside, the prisoners cried out, their voices muffled by the rising heat. Some had already gone silent. The air shimmered, and the smell was a suffocating blend of metal, sweat, and burning flesh. Kael stood at the top of the mold, his robes whipped by the hot wind, watching the gold rise. His eyes were fixed not on the enemy beyond the walls, but on the metal below, as though it were the true battlefield. That was when the first boulder struck. It hit the outer wall with a sound like the crack of the earth itself. Stones tumbled into the streets. Soldiers shouted, running to the breaches. A second boulder followed, then a third. The allied armies had begun their assault. Kael did not move. Instead, he called for more gold to be poured, screaming at his alchemists to work faster. The obelisk must be finished. The enemy must see it before they took the city. But fate would not grant him that satisfaction. As the gold reached its final height, a massive explosion shook the courtyard. One of the furnaces had ruptured, sending molten metal spilling across the stone. The heat was unbearable. Soldiers stumbled back, their armor glowing red where it touched the air. Some collapsed, their flesh fusing to the gold dot in the chaos. A section of the wall gave way. Haravith and Senthal poured into the city like a tide of steel. The fighting was brief and brutal. Ayartha's soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, could not hold the streets. Fires spread from building to building. The screams of the dying mingled with the clash of steel and the crackle of flames. Kael retreated to the Hall of Echoes. There, surrounded by his golden dead, he waited. Some say he planned to fight to the death. Others believe he intended to seal himself in molten gold, to become part of his collection. What happened next is still debated. When the allied commanders entered the hall, they found the throne empty. The statues stood as they always had, gleaming in the firelight, their faces locked in silent terror. And at the center of the room, a pool of cooling gold lay across the floor, rippling faintly as if something had sunk beneath it. Some swore they saw a crown trapped just below the surface. Centuries passed. The desert claimed what the fire and sword had left behind. Ayartha became a name in stories told by nomads around their campfires, a place where gold and madness had once walked hand in hand. The walls fell to sand. The gardens became dust. The Hall of Echoes, with its frozen figures, was buried under centuries of shifting dunes. Only the obelisk remained. It stood at the edge of the ruins, leaning slightly to one side, its surface pitted by wind but still gleaming faintly. When the sun struck it, travelers spoke of the way it seemed to hum in the heat, as though something inside was still alive, still straining against its golden tomb. Few dared to touch it. The first real attempt to study Ayartha came in the late 19th century, when European archaeologists, driven by rumors of a city of molten kings, organized an expedition into the deep desert. They were led by Sir Alaric Dunn, a man whose obsession with lost empires had bankrupted to previous ventures. The journey was harsh 3 weeks of blistering sun, freezing nights, and sandstorms that swallowed entire camps. But when they finally crested a high dune and saw the obelisk glinting in the distance, Dunn wrote in his journal, "I felt as though I had stepped into a dream, and the dream was watching me. The excavation revealed fragments of the old walls, charred timbers, shards of painted pottery. In the center, beneath meters of sand, they uncovered the remains of the Hall of Echoes. What they found inside shook even the most hardened men. The statues, if they could be called, that were more lifelike than any sculpture of the period should have been. Every line of muscle, every fold of skin, every expression of pain had been captured with impossible precision. Tests later confirmed what the Desert Whispers had long suggested. These were not works of art. They were the bodies of Kael's enemies, encased in gold while still alive, and in the center of the hall they found the pool. The gold was thick and rippled, as if frozen mid-wave. Embedded just beneath the surface was a circular object, flattened in places, but unmistakable. A crown. Dunn wanted to extract it, but the metal's density and the desert's heat made it impossible. In the end, they documented it, photographed it, and left it where it lay. Dunn's final notes on the subject are unsettling. "When I stood over the crown, the air felt heavy, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I was certain something moved beneath the gold. The obelisk proved even more disturbing. Cutting into its side, revealed layers of molten metal poured over what had once been wood, rope, and at its core bones, dozens of skeletons, tangled together in postures of agony, fused forever into the golden interior. Radiocarbon dating matched the bones to the late reign of Kael. Some scholars debated whether this truly proved the legend. Others argued that the sheer scale of the monument, combined with the human remains, left little room for doubt. The desert, as always, kept its own counsel. Today, Ayartha is a restricted archaeological site. The obelisk still stands, guarded by fences and posted warnings. The Hall of Echoes is covered again with sand, partly to preserve it, partly because too many visitors reported strange sensations while inside. Some felt watched, others claimed to hear faint screams when the wind shifted. But the molten gold remains, holding its secrets. And so the story comes back to where it began, the moment when gold became not just a symbol of wealth, but a weapon of terror. Kael believed that by encasing his enemies in the metal, he was preserving his power forever. But gold does not preserve power, it preserves silence. If there is a lesson in Ayartha's fall, it is this: wealth can buy monuments, but not loyalty. Fear can build empires, but not keep them. And no matter how bright the gold, it cannot blind time. Somewhere beneath that crown-shaped shadow, in the Hall of Echoes, a man who thought himself untouchable lies entombed. The desert does not care for kings. In the end, all it leaves behind is the glitter of ruin.